Most people think the use of force is about tactics. Most officers think it's about control. But force science tells us something different. Use of force is often about perception under stress. When perception narrows, time collapses. When time collapses, distance closes. When distance closes, options disappear. And that's where force becomes more likely. Hi, I'm John Gabrielson, and welcome to the Blue Line Project. I'm so excited about this week's podcast and what we have in store for you. We're going to go into the topic of use of force, and can be very controversial. There's been a lot of this in the news recently. We're going to hit some hot topics, and like I said, we're not going to steer away from controversy on this show, but I want to bring what I like to say is facts to fiction, and I want to tell the truth, and we're going to bring receipts. And if everything that we talk about in our shows and all the research will always be in the comment section below, in the description section below. We want you to leave your comments. Let us know how we're doing, if you like the show or what we can improve upon. If you do like the show and what we're doing here, make sure that you like and follow us on whatever platform, whether it's YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, or wherever else the show will be hosted and platformed. We want you to follow and tell all your friends and send them the link. And let's build this into something really special and really unique, because really what we want to do is make a show that's fun and entertaining, talking about current events that relates to law enforcement. But really, the show's educational, and I want it to be educational for those that are watching. I want you to be able to take something away from it, whether you're a community member, a police executive, a line officer, a security guard, or a security professional. It doesn't matter. This show is for you, and it's for the community itself. Just to give you an idea of what's coming up, I'm really excited. In 2 weeks, we're going to have Assistant Chief Jared Wallace from Waco Police Department will be on the broadcast, and it's going to be a really important broadcast. We're going to be talking about officer wellness, and I know over my 20 years, I've lost a couple officers that were friends of mine and acquaintances to suicide, and the mental health that we need to put into and the care that we need for our officers is critically important. I know that in my career, after my couple critical incidents, I really needed the services that the Office Police Department provided, and we have a pretty robust program, and I know other departments do as well. So we want to highlight that and talk about the things that we can do to protect our officers. But for this week, we're going to talk about use of force, and this is a pretty hot topic, and it's been in the news media, especially with some high-profile cases that we'll highlight. But with this show, as with everything, we want to bring facts to fiction. We want to bring facts to a narrative. We want to dispel common narratives, but we want to also educate people. Whether you're a police executive or a line officer or a community member that found our show, I want you to be able to get something out of this so that you can be a little bit more educated. But something else I want to challenge you with. In this show, I don't want you to believe what I say because I'm some authority. I'm just a guy, just a dude sitting behind a microphone in a studio, sharing my thoughts and opinions based on facts and research that I've done with you. And I want you to challenge everything. Go do your own research. Be your own researcher, because I think that's really critically important. And in each show, you'll see, if you go down to the description section, you'll see there in the description that we'll put links and things to the articles and research papers that we talk about. Yes, this show is what I would call evidence-based because we're bringing in research, but we're coming in from a practitioner standpoint. So I don't want to get all academic and gobbledygook over here. I just want to be real, down-to-earth, practical, brass tacks, talk the way that it is, plain speak. And this show is about use of force. And if you saw the show title, I say it, the use of force myth. And why do I say myth? Well, there's a lot of misunderstanding around what actually happens in the use of force escalation. How do police officers make those decisions? What are the legal parameters? What do policies and procedures have to do it? And really, there's a reality versus a perception of use of force. And that reality versus perception is a big deal, because it can really change the way we observe or see how we approach it. So again, just be sure to like us on LinkedIn and X as we get into it. But when we're talking about use of force, there's passion on both sides. There's people on both sides of the issues. And if you remember going back to the episode that we did to kind of launch the podcast, which I call episode 0, I talked about moral outrage. And moral outrage to me really is the quintessential issue that faces use of force because there's moral outrage based on misunderstanding on both sides. Whether you're for the police or against the police, or you want to defund the police, or you think the police can do no wrong, there's actually a medium ground that we have to find in there because at the end of the day, police officers, just like everybody else, we're human beings. I get up every morning. I put my pants on one leg at a time. I have a family. I have a wife. I have kids. I have my dogs, Dodger and Cooper, which I absolutely love. And maybe down the road in a future podcast, you'll get to meet the canine parts of the family. But with that being said, we have kids and lives, right? So that's, police officers are human. We are nothing special. We're just people that have chosen to serve their community in this way. No different than a doctor, lawyer, or a fire EMS or a nurse, right? We're just human beings and we are fallible. And I want to bring that to this show today. But we have these misconceptions and we have to present facts and we have to look at them correctly because we've just seen recently in the news coming out of Minnesota. We're going to focus on those two cases a little bit later. We see moral outrage, right? We see an incident happen. People are out protesting, and then legitimate protests turn into non-legitimate protests because once you stop just being peaceful and giving your voice and standing on a sidewalk holding a sign, maybe saying what your issue is, and you move into actual interference with law enforcement duties, blocking roadways, throwing objects, starting fires, interrupting church services, violating other people's rights, you've no longer are under the First Amendment. You've now moved into another category of an unlawful assembly or an unlawful behavior. And I think that's lost on people. I hear people say all the time, especially related to law enforcement and protesting, is I've been to many protests. I've worked many protests in Austin, and we let people walk up and down the sidewalks and we let them give their voice, and that's fine. But there's a fine line between protest and unlawful assembly. But that's not the point of the show. But with that being said, I want to look at how use of force plays a role. I want to talk about use of force in a reality versus perception. I'm going to bring both sides of the coin. I'm going to bring what is the view of the law enforcement officer and what is the view of the public. And then what are steps? Like I told you in previous podcasts, this show is about solutions. We're not just going to identify a problem. We're going to bring real world solutions, things that I've personally used on the street, things that either my department's done or I've researched in other departments that have been done. But let's start with one of the first misconceptions about law enforcement. That is, the police use of force is rampant, it's racially biased, and it's unnecessary. And I want to rampant, racially biased, and unnecessary. And this is fueled by media framing. What do I mean by framing? So the media has a narrative or a story they want to tell. So they're going to take whatever incident happens and they're going to tell the story based on what they do. If that means they have to leave out facts of the case, they'll leave out facts of the case. But they're going to frame and tell you a story. And I want to always give due to who gets due. But another host who I actually listened to his podcast, Dan Bongino, he says that there is the story, but they tell you a story. And we want to tell you what the real story is, not the story that the media narrative lays out. Would it be surprised for me to tell you that under 2% of all police encounters end in use of force? That's correct. Under 2% of police encounters end in a use of force. Now think about this. And I said this a few years ago when I was talking to a group of people. Just think about, let's take the Austin Police Department. And in a shift, a single officer, given all the calls that are out there, might respond to 10 or 12 calls, depending on the shift, right? And they may make one arrest, two at the most. Now, I want you to take and roll that amount of call taking out to, 70 or 80 officers on the street at any given time, and then roll that out across a day where you have hundreds of officers on the street with multiple shifts taking multiple calls. So now you're, 2, 3, 4,000 calls a day. Then I want you to roll that call load out. Now roll it out to a month, a week, 2 weeks, a year. You quickly, with the multiplying effect, you're getting into literally millions and millions of calls that are taken by police. That's not even factoring in traffic stops, subject stops, and other interactions. So you put all of that together, and less than 2% into some kind of a use of force encounter. What that tells us is we don't have a use of force problem, right? We have a reality or a perception problem. We have a misunderstanding of what actually happens in these police encounters. This misunderstanding leads to anger, confusion, outrage, and what is it based on? Truly ignorance. Now, ignorance isn't meant to say that or to be insulting. It's people just don't know. They get a TikTok narrative, a Facebook or X narrative, or whatever social media platform narrative, and that becomes a narrative. I saw a news story just the other day on X, and it came out of Fox News, and they were talking about most people get their news just from Apple News or Apple News alone. So they're only getting one side of the story. So if you're only getting one side of the story without all the facts, then how can you make good decisions about what you see? So what I'm trying to say is people run on emotion, they don't have logic and reason, and they're not getting all of the facts. And this brings me back to two tragic incidents that happened with ICE and the moral outrage that we found on both sides. Now, I referred to these cases in the very first episode. But let's first talk about Renee Good. So she claimed to be a lawful and conducting protests. Okay. But let's talk about her actions, and then we're going to talk about the actions of the officers. So she was following ICE agents. She was harassing and antagonizing ICE agents, which by itself isn't really illegal. However, she then blocked a roadway with her vehicle. Her and her partner then began to interfere in ICE operations. When she was approached by ICE agents, she then drove her car, started to move her car towards a U.S. federal agent, striking that agent, which led to the discharge of a firearm, and she was ultimately shot and killed. That is a tragic, tragic incident. And I believe that both sides had issues and both sides could have done things better. Having been involved in an officer-involved shooting, I can tell you there's no heroes. In that situation, there were no heroes. And it was just a bad, sucky situation all the way around. And the tragic result is an American citizen lost her life when it need not happen that way. And then Alex Pretty, again, he interfered with ICE operations, claiming to be protesting. Although it's legal and lawful to carry a weapon under the Second Amendment in the United States, bringing that weapon into a highly volatile situation and then interfering with police or ICE agents doing lawful duties, claiming to be protesting, and then you end up getting shot because you have escalated a situation. Not saying what the officers did was right. I'm just saying that person's actions coupled with the ICE agent's actions and the interference escalated the situation, and what did it lead to? Another tragic death. But here's the truth. Both of those incidents were absolutely avoidable. I believe things could have been different on both sides. And like I said, there's truly no winners in either of these cases. But there is a legal standard to which law enforcement has to be held by. And that brings me back to the case of Graham versus Connor, which came to us in 1989. Now, this case established that, and I'm going to read right here, this case has established that reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene, rather than with 20/20 hindsight vision. So what that means is when you judge a use of force situation, according to Graham versus Connor, that a police officer is involved in, and this is the interpretation of our courts, you have to look at it from the exact moment the officer was in. What decisions did they make in that moment? You cannot go back and look at a TikTok video, a YouTube video, or any other video and slow it down and freeze frame it and go play by play and then say, well, you see, the officer should have seen this, the officer should have seen that, he should have done this, he should have done that. Okay, you can't do that because the officer does not have the luxury of 2020 hindsight in the moment that he or she has to make the decision of what to do, what level of force is appropriate based on the actions of the subject. So here's the things that are considered from the law enforcement side of the house. When any deadly force situation happens, or any use of force situation happens, number one, it's called objectionable reasonableness. Officer's viewpoint is rapidly changing in any situation, and you have to see what that viewpoint is and why they made the decision in that moment in time. That's why you interview the officer. That's why you do an investigation. That's why you let the facts come out before you race to conclusions. But you see, in a TikTok world and in this world that we live in, people want immediacy. They want it right now. There is no ability to truly wait. So they upload a video giving you half of the story, and boom, we all make our decisions and we hold a trial basically in court of public opinion based on nothing except hearsay and a video that may or may not show the whole incident. Another thing that we look at in law enforcement and that is looked at when these cases are reviewed is all the relative factors involved. What was the severity of the crime? Was there an immediate threat? Was there resistance? Was a person fleeing? What were the circumstances around that? So was it objectively reasonable? And how do you get that is understanding the relative factors. And this Graham standard also goes out and is covered and has been attached to through and under the 14th Amendment. There's another case, Kingsley versus Hendrickson, out of 2015, that goes into pretrial detainees and things as well regard to the Graham standard. So this objective standard wasn't new to the Graham versus Connor case. The objective standard regarding reasonable persons who believe was also a concept found in Terry versus Ohio, which came out in 1968. So again, another case saying that the objective or objective reasonable standard must be met. So Graham and Terry really set those standards for us. So let's go back to each one of these situations. Now, based on the Graham standard, based on Graham versus Connor, the agent that was involved with Renee Good was just in front, off to, I believe, the left side of the vehicle. They had approached, asked her to exit the vehicle. She refused. She then accelerated what appeared to be and ultimately was towards the officer where he got hit. A firearm was discharged and she was killed. So let's look at the objective or reasonable. If you yourself were in front of a moving vehicle and that vehicle started coming towards you in an aggressive manner with an acceleration, would you, in that situation, if you had a firearm, discharge it in the protection of yourself? That's the standard. A reasonable person put in that situation. Now, for my folks that are out there that are just hyper vigilant and completely partisan and don't want to look at facts, well, you're probably going to say, no, I would jump out of the way or some other thing that's silly and unreasonable. For my folks that are reasoned and want to logically think this through, take the objective and reasonable standard, put yourself in the position of that agent. What would you have done? And that's the standard. I'm not saying it was right. I'm not saying it was wrong. Now, from a law enforcement standard, I think that placing yourself in front or in the path of a moving vehicle is horrible tactics. And if I was the ones investigating that, although I would say the use of deadly force was legitimate under law and policy, I would say that it could have been forced because bad tactics were employed and the way in which the officers, the agents approached the vehicle could have been much better. There was 10 times things they could have done better. And one of the things I learned being a police officer and having used force many times and been involved in my own officer-involved shooting, you have to look at it from your perspective, and then afterwards you go back and look at it hindsight 50-50, you debrief. Okay, what could I have done better? How could I have changed this? What could we do better next time? So that is absolutely paramount in every situation because that's how we learn. That's how we get better as officers. Now let's go from Renee's Good's standpoint. If she would have cooperated with the officers, if she would have stepped out of the vehicle, if she had not accelerated towards the officer, if she hadn't been harassing and antagonizing the officers all day, if she had not been interfering with officers, but rather filming the officers from a distance or on the sidewalk with her video camera, then this situation never happens. So if the officers use better tactics, the situation doesn't happen. If Renee Good is a little bit wiser in her decision-making process, it doesn't happen. Both sides. The middle, tragedy, it never should have happened, but it did. So we have to evaluate the reasons why and how we could prevent this from happening in the future. Going back to Alex Perrette. Again, if he would have stood on the sidewalk from his perspective and filmed the officers and said his piece and stood back and not interfered, the officers had had no reason to make contact. And the weapon on him would have been no big deal. But no, he chose to break a taillight on a car, which we later saw. He then interjected himself into a situation, causing the reaction from the officers, which led to a firearm being exposed. Whether it was an accidental discharge from the officer or whether or what actually happened is unclear. We have to wait for those investigations to come out. But at the end of the day, if he stays at a distance, films, protests, that's fine. You cannot interfere with officers. From the officer's perspective, they kind of was in, I saw the video, it was kind of a gang type of a takedown. There was struggle. There was a firearm seen during the struggle, but there were multiple officers around him. When the firearm was seen or however that happened, the officers kind of separated. Again, I think you'd have to look at it from different angles to see how the officers could have done things differently, but that's what you go back and look after. But the actual use of force in that instant, again, using the Graham standard, there was a gun, suspect was resisting, possibly reaching for the weapon was discharged in self-defense. At that time, if you were in that, would a reasonable person have done the same thing? I believe, yes, a reasonable person in that situation would have had the same reaction as that officer. So that's how we can understand objectionable reasonableness and the Graham standard. So this is how officer-involved shootings and all use of force is looked at. Whether it's the most minor takedown to deadly force, we look at, was the force objectively reasonable? Would a rational person do the same thing given that same situation based on their training and policy? And of course, ultimately the law. Like here in Texas, Chapter 9 of the Penal Code talks about deadly force and the authorization of use of that force. And if that force is considered good and objectable, reasonable, then it's considered what they would call a justified homicide, which means the taking of a life was legitimate, therefore okay under the law. But I want to say this clearly. No one wants to see anybody's lives lost, and no one wants to see police officers or community members and citizens of this great country injured, harmed by law enforcement. I want to say that training is getting so much better over the years, and we're bringing new concepts. And now I want to turn the corner. We've kind of talked about these two incidents and gotten my thoughts and opinions on it. But I believe we can have meaningfully reduction in the use of force incidents, and we're already seeing stats and figures as we introduce the ideas of procedural justice in use of force. And procedural justice to me is one of the most important training components that we can give to our law enforcement officers, period. Also, when you talk about use of force and police incidents, you have to take a community policing approach, and you have to have better de-escalation tactics. But I do have one fear, and I want to put this out there for my police supervisors and administrators that are listening to this podcast. Yes, we have to emphasize de-escalation. But I believe that we're almost emphasizing it too much, almost to the detriment of the officer. And this is what I mean by this. Officers are so concerned about de-escalation that they're missing minor cues that suspects give them, and sometimes a use of force or a physical confrontation is inevitable and you cannot stop it. The suspect has made a decision in their mind that they are going to fight, And officers can't be so focused on de-escalation techniques that they're missing the cues that the suspect gives them, whether it be words like, I'm not going back to jail, this is not going to go this way, I can't go with you, or they take off their hat, take off their jacket, do what I call the felony stretch, right? You know, kind of clench their fist. There's so many different cues, blade off in almost a fighting stance. These are all things that you've got to see as an officer and you've got to pick up on. And if you're too busy de-escalating and trying verbal judo and you're not paying attention to their actions and their words, it could be a really bad day for an officer on the street because they're going to be on their heels and not ready. Or if you allow that suspect to get into your space. I mean, I saw one video where an officer actually allowed a suspect in his face and he was poking him in the badge and the officer did nothing, backed up. That cannot be allowed to happen. Like if that person comes in your space and actually touches you, that's a takedown. And that should be an immediate takedown. And so that's my only fear, is that we put too much emphasis on de-escalation. We don't get enough emphasis on seeing the warning signs. So there's a fine balance that we have to reach in law enforcement. But that's my biggest warning. But these strategies I'm talking about is in the show is going to really help us, both as citizens and officers, I believe, to bring and continue to bring down our uses of forces. But before we get to that, there's two things that I want to remember. Number one, what was the reality to review of the officer? Remember, when an officer is in that situation and stress levels goes up and things happen, the officer will experience what we call time compression, which means time seems to shorten down. Things get slower. They can just compress. And you have this feeling. It's like when I was in my officer-involved shooting, the best way I can describe it was like everything narrowed down and everything became bigger. And even though time was moving extremely fast, it felt like it was moving extremely slow. Number two, people think police officers, maybe they watch movies, but our reaction times, if somebody is attacking us, is much slower than you might think. You know, a good draw, we practice at the range, drawing, in under 2 seconds from our holsters. Okay, I can get to that draw and I can be, fast. But here's my question. Is my reaction to their movement towards me, what is that time frame, right? So they've already pre-planned what they're doing and I'm reacting to it. That's why you've got to try to get ahead of it by watching for cues and things to see the attack coming if you can. So just remember, our reaction time, we're not robots, we're not machines. So our reaction time is going to be limited by what we know at the time and how fast our reacting is, which goes back to our training as well. Something else that I want you guys to remember in all reality, when you're dealing with a police officer, especially in a tense situation, that furtive movements or those sudden movements, they can be processed as threats, and they probably will be processed as threats. When I'm out on a subject and they keep trying to put their hands in their pockets, I'm saying, hey, keep your hands out of your pockets. Hey, man, keep your hands out of your pockets, right? Hey, don't make any sudden movements. Just keep your hands where I can see them. Why am I saying that? I'm not saying that to be a jerk. I'm not saying that to be some kind of a dom. I'm saying that for my own safety, because if I can see hands, hands kill. So if I see hands, then I know that I'm ahead of the curve. But if they're putting their hands in their pockets, I don't know what's in their pockets. Maybe I haven't done a frisk. So again, if they keep putting their hands in the pocket, what do you think is going to happen? Hey man, I'm going to frisk you if you're going to keep putting your hands in your pockets. So these are just things that I want you to think about from a police officer's perspective for my community members watching this. But then in any use of force situation, you also have the public perception. And that is, well, why didn't the officer just wait? Why didn't the officer talk more? Or why did the officer escalate the situation? Well, those are all great questions. But until you've actually been in the position of the officer, seeing what they're seeing in their training and experience, your why didn't they just wait or why didn't they just talk more could be a misconception, may not be reality, right? The public sees a video in slow motion. A public goes on TikTok and slows it down and watches it from 10 different angles. The officer does not. The officer experiences that same video that you watch in milliseconds. So you're watching a video on TikTok and saying, oh man, he should have done this, he should have done that. But the officer has milliseconds to make a decision in that situation. And I think that's lost on the public. The gap between those two realities is what, in my opinion, creates the distrust. And I believe really the fault lies, again, as I've said in other podcasts, back on the police departments, because I just don't think we do a good job of educating the public on what our jobs are and why things happen the way they happen. So we as police departments, we need to do a better job. And that's one of the reasons why I host this podcast. So I want to turn the corner and kind of change where we're going. I've kind of identified the problems. I've talked about the techniques. I've talked about reality versus perception, officers' reality, public's reality. But where does procedural justice, that little thing that I talked about earlier, where does that come in? Well, procedural justice is not about being polite. It's not about creating just a nice situation. It's about psychological space. So in use of force, right, time equals distance, right? So I want to put things between me. I want to create distance, right? But time equals distance. And when officers use good procedural justice, and we'll talk about that with us here in a second, we can create more time and distance by what we're doing and how we're doing it. So the first thing procedural justice is providing a voice. Providing a voice to the individual. Letting them talk. Hearing what they have to say. Closing your mouth and opening up your ears. That's huge. I like to talk. Everybody who knows me, I like to talk and probably talk too damn much. But put that aside. When I'm on the street and I'm interacting with people on the street, I have learned to close my mouth and open my ears, because the bad guys, the suspects, the bad actors will tell you oftentimes what they're going to do or what their intent is. And you're giving them voice. So if they ask you a question, you give them an answer and you give them voice. So that means active listening. Number two, officers need to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. When I do my 7-step approach on a traffic stop, why do I tell the violator why I stopped them? Because I want them to know why I'm there. So that's really important, right? So we're going to give them voice, and we want to explain what we're doing in that voice and give them a chance to express their opinions back. But then there's another pillar, and that is just to demonstrate neutrality and to be neutral in my actions. What does that mean? That means fair in my decision making. So in my decision making process, I must be fair and equal. And how do I do that? By giving them voice and listening to what they have to say. And then I need to show respect, right? I need to show respect. And how do I do that? Well, again, that means I act in a trustworthy manner. You know, if I say I'm going to get them a bottle of water, I'm going to get them a bottle of water. Whatever I say, I actually do. If I tell them, hey, if you have weed in your pocket, you tell me about it, I'm not going to charge you with it. I'm just going to turn it for destruction. I actually do that. I don't then get the weed and turn around and charge them for it. Well, why is this? Why are these things so important? Procedural justice, in essence, slows things down. Slows things down. And if I'm slowing things down, what does that do? It creates more time. Because in these situations, I have fear and stress on both sides, right? The person I'm interacting with has fear and stress, and I have fear and stress. I want to say something here. If a police officer, if you know a police officer and they ever tell you, oh, I'm never afraid, I'm going to tell you they're full of BS. Bravo Sierra, right? As a police officer, you get scared, you have fear. It's how you handle that fear, where you channel that fear, that makes all the difference in the world. Remember, I said earlier, police officers are not robots. We are humans. We are fallible. We make mistakes. But make no mistake, police officers at all levels are held to a very high standard. And because we are human and make mistakes does not somehow negate bad decisions or wrongdoing. It just means that we're fallible and we're not perfect. So from the officer's perspective, if I'm doing good procedural justice and I'm slowing things down and I'm giving you a voice, I'm listening to what you have to say, I'm answering your questions, I'm telling you why they're there, I'm being trustworthy in my motives, I'm being neutral in my actions, fear begins to drop. Movements are slowed down, voice volume drops, resistance often then decreases on the other side because I'm calm. In my leadership class, I talk about temperance. That is what you need as an officer. Temperance. When you bring temperance into the situation, I'm going to go back to the video with those ICE officers. When they approached Renee Good, they were up here. They were already amped up. Now imagine if they would have given her the voice and brought it down and slowed it down. Imagine how that could have been different. That's where I'm putting it back on the officers of slowing things down. When you slow things down, you regain a cognitive bandwidth. That alone, when you're talking about the use of force science, creates time. And time equals distance, and distance is the key to an successful crowds. That is force science at its best by slowing things down. So when you slow things down, here's what that operational flow looks like. Officer establishes presence and purpose upon their initial approach. The officer then gives the subject voice. The subject feels heard instead of threatened. That then changes the emotional cognition, decreases. The officer maintains an increased distance. Time expands, and then more options become available. That's what happens. So you have presence, voice, subject feels heard, emotions go down, officer maintains or increases the distance, which relates to time, which gives you more time, and then more options become available, and you can talk somebody down and talk them into handcuffs or whatever needs to be done. So procedural justice then protects the distance that you create physically by bringing people down, slowing the situation down, creating that time and distance space. And that more time ultimately protects everyone. And this procedural justice training absolutely reduces force through fairness. And it emphasizes the 4 pillars of voice, neutrality, respect, and trustworthiness. Again, I want you to get those. Voice, neutrality, respect, and trustworthiness. So you're shifting command and control to relationship policing. That is the goal. The goal is relationship policing. That's why we have community engagement. That's why we have procedural justice. That's why we slow things down. Because when you build relationships with people, even in that brief moment, and connect with them, and they know that you are treating them as a fellow human, then you slow things down. So you can take a person that has nothing in common with you, slow it down, give them a voice, respect them, and guess what? You can get a better outcome. And so I believe that's what we should be doing more, especially in these protest situations where it's already volatile. You have moral outrage on both sides. You've got to slow things down, and you've got to have better interactions, and it'll directly cut into your use of force, and it'll lower it dramatically. In fact, Chicago Police Department, as I'm looking at this one study here, did a large-scale study on this, and they had 8,000 officers received procedural justice training. Check these numbers out as I read off of this. Look at here. Complaints dropped 10%, right, over 2 years. Use of force incidents fell 6.4%, right? Force involving weapons decreased, right? Non-escalatory tactics were very beneficial, and they allowed officers to de-escalate earlier in situations. During this experiment, the administrative data shows and tells us that this actually works because this impact had a huge, huge impact on the use of force numbers in the city of Chicago. Here was another one from the National Policing Institute in Tucson, Cambridge, and Houston. This one, they checked crime hotspots, and they used traditional training versus procedural justice. And here's the thing. When officers had a procedural justice approach in attitude and actions, they were far more respectful to the public. They had respectable behaviors. They gave voice. And instead of coming in like a commander, they came in more of a relationship style and allowed them to have better outcomes. Check this out. Out of this study from National Policing, 60% fewer arrests, 14% less crime. This was in 2022. The first one in Chicago was in 2020. Here was another one. A 2023 meta-analysis of 27 reforms, including procedural justice element, found most reductions in force, 11%, and complaints went down by 18%. And it was strongest because more voluntary compliance was given by suspects when officers were fair and gave fair treatment. And it boosted morale among officers and also built public trust. These studies show us that procedural justice, when implemented correctly by officers on the street, will lower use of force incidents and create and build public trust. Now, take procedural justice and now connect that to community policing, right? A concept that came around in the 1970s, was huge in the 80s and the 90s, even when I started APD. But here's the problem. Community policing was a unit, not culture. Let me say that again. Community policing was a unit, not culture. We have to make community policing the culture. This is why I love teaching community engagement and crime prevention on patrol. It's a great class because you take these things that we're talking about here and you introduce it to officers on the street. And you say, hey, this is a better way to do it. At APD, we have a thing called ICAT training. We have other training that we do, and it's all about these things, slowing things down, giving people a voice, talking better, and giving more respect. And it's huge, absolutely huge. When you take community policing and you partner it with problem-oriented policing, it's an absolute, utter game changer. Here's one right here out of New Haven. This is from a study in 2019. Uniform officers made briefs, positive visits, no enforcement. This improved attitudes toward police legitimacy and willingness to cooperate, key to reducing use of force in the future. So all they did was go out and do door-to-door surveys, build relationships with the people in the community, and guess what? The people began to have more respect and use of force went down. And that was it. That simple. Here's what's crazy. Sir Robert Peel told us many of these same things, right? He said if you basically make people believe that the police are legitimate and you build trust among the people, Peel says people will then voluntarily comply and use of force will go down. Crazy how that works. Absolutely crazy how that works. One of the things that we have now, like I said, we have really good, much better de-escalation training. It's called direct harm reduction without added risks. And you have, here's a study from Louisville, ICAT, which I was telling you about. What does ICAT stand for? Integrating Communication, Assessment, and Tactics. And when you do this, 28% fewer use of force incidents, 26 fewer citizen injuries, 36% fewer officer injuries versus controls. And this was a study out of Louisville in 2022. Here's one out of Tempe, Arizona. Again, this is in 2023. Again, using the direct harm reduction training with ICATs. Again, here, citizen injuries there in Tempe, Arizona, 58% drop. An increased encounter, more time talking, less rushing, with no rise in officer injuries, right? Body-worn cameras, where they use those in the analysis. Here's one out of the UK. In 2024, same thing, 8 to 11% drop in force. Citizen civilian injuries went down. And again, no increase in officer harm or depolicing. So what are we getting out of this? De-escalation gives tools to slow down. And what's the tool of de-escalation? Simple, giving people a voice. Listen to what they have to say. Be neutral in your actions. Trustworthy in your motives. It's really quite simple, and it works. What are the benefits that come to this, right? Reduces unnecessary resistance, lowers the likelihood of injury, improves decision clarity under stress, and protects officer safety. So when we're talking about use of force, I hope you can see the pattern that I'm going through here as I go through these studies. Police departments have truly taken steps forward to do a better job. And so maybe if you're a community member, rather than rushing to judgment and assuming that police are all bad or, out there being racially motivated by their actions, go back and listen to the last episode when we talked about the numbers and the real reality behind, why police are where they are and hotspots and things. And why don't you examine the benefits that were actually coming as a result of the better training that everybody's been begging for? Because the police department benefits because they have fewer officers hurt, lower incidents of use of force. The public benefits because they now have a better feeling about police, believe police are more legitimate, police are actually being fair and reasonable in their actions. So what are these benefits for everybody? Well, the community now can feel that the police are working for them in true partnership. And that's really what we're looking for in law enforcement. Sir Robert Peel said, and I keep going back to him because I think we've really forgotten his principles. But Sir Robert Peel said, the people are the police and the police are the people. We are the community. We are all the community. We have to show each other respect. But we as police have to earn that respect by doing our jobs better, by being procedurally just, by giving people a voice, right? This is why I'm so in love with the crime-free housing program, because the crime-free housing program goes into these apartment complexes, builds relationships with the managers, and then we have a working operational relationship to make the quality of life better. We're working together to make a better life for everybody. How do you do that? By taking personal responsibility and accountability for your property, for your life, for your family. So the challenge to my community members listening to this, examine what you do. Relook at these things. Understand that police officers aren't robots, right? Go back and read the Graham versus the Graham case, right? Go back and read Terry versus Ohio. Go back and understand what these are, right? And how it all works and the benefits of that come from the improvements in law enforcement. Peel understood this long before we had neuroscience and long before we had all these studies. Police effectiveness depends on public approval. And I've told this to my fellow officers. If we are going to lose the public trust and we're going to try to bully the public or whatever, and we lose that trust, we don't have any more money in the bank, you might as well take your badge off and go home. Because the reality is you're not going to be able to do your job effectively. And the only way you're going to be able to do your job effectively if you lose trust is ultimate tyranny, and nobody wants that. So use of force. The reality is it's never pretty. The reality is there really are no heroes. The reality is people on both sides can do better. So maybe we should have less moral outrage, more open dialogue, and talk to each other and truly understand what's happening. And if you're listening to this podcast, I would encourage you to go to your police department, get involved with the Citizens Police Academy. They'll put you through some use of force scenarios to see how you would react. And understand that when you're judging any actions taken by a police officer, please apply the Graham versus Connor standard. Don't go back and sit in your chair and Monday morning quarterback everything the officer do. Put yourself into that moment. Really put yourself into that officer's shoes and say, what would I have done? And I think that'll really help clear it up for you. I think that'll really help bring into focus the stress that police officers truly are under every single day. What the goal is for all police departments is we want approval to increase, we want relationships to be stronger, and we want to be at one with our community. And I believe bringing Peel's principles and talking about them like we do on each episode really, really helps. Procedural justice doesn't replace tactics, right? It makes tactics work better for us. That's really the goal. And that's where I want to be. This has been good. I hope you guys have learned something. In the next episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about supervisors as it relates to use of force and what they have. If you like this broadcast, if you like this podcast, please follow us on Rumble, follow us on YouTube, or wherever you can find this broadcast. Tell all your friends, share the links, hit those like buttons, subscribe, follow me. And I'm really excited about doing this and it just growing and getting better and better. And if you have topics that you want me to discuss or current events that you want me to bring up, please send those my way. I would love to hear from you. Leave a note or a comment in the comment section. Like I said, I'll have all the studies that I referred to. They'll be there in the details page. So I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. And until next week, This is John Gabrielson for the Blue Line Project here on the Crime Reduction Institute Network, signing off. See you next week.